Welcome to India and the World podcast. In the past 3 episodes, we have looked at the origin of the deep rooted animosity between India and Pakistan. The process of partition, filled with violence and intrigues, sowed the seeds of distrust on both sides. The Kashmir issue led to a year-long war between the two newly independent nations. The fighting ended, but peace didn't ensue. Instead, the UN brokered ceasefire put the issue in a limbo, a constant irritant between the two countries. In today's episode, we will go a little further back in time to see the intrigues that led to the partition in the first place. For decades, the narrative of partition has two versions. The common Indian point of view is that British maliciously used a divide and rule policy to tear apart a subcontinent that was naturally united despite its diversity. We feel that they exploited the religious insecurities of the Muslims, which they actively fueled, and patronized the Muslim League. On the other hand, Pakistani official narrative is that Hindus and Muslims were always two distinct nations. It was impossible for a Muslim minority to live with peace and safety in a Hindu majority nation, and thus partition was a necessity. They view it as the inevitable glorious triumph of Islamic nation that already existed within the subcontinent even under the British rule. Today, we are going to examine the partition of India through a different, much colder lens, that of global geopolitics. Official documents of the period leading up to the partition, military assessments, diplomatic correspondence and government memos, which have been declassified over time, give us a clearer picture. I came across two books where the authors have gone through these documents in detail and analyzed the events around the partition in light of this new information. If you are interested to read more about the topic, I would strongly recommend these books: The Shadow of the Great Game by Narendra Singh Sarila and War and Diplomacy in Kashmir by Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. I also accessed declassified US State Department papers available online to understand the US stance and role. I have included these sources in the description of this episode for those of you who are interested to read them. So these books and documents provide a stunning insight that the creation of Pakistan wasn't just the outcome of a communal divide. It was a deliberately calculated move in the great game between the West and the Soviet Union. How a sentiment held by a faction amongst the Muslims of India was encouraged and given credence by the British to further their own geopolitical interests in the region. So what were these geopolitical compulsions of Britain and her allies, and what part did the subcontinent play in them? In the 19th century, Britain derived its power to dominate the world through its control over the shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean. The British Empire controlled the shipping traffic because they held all the key ports along Indian Ocean: Port Said, Aden, South Africa, Singapore and Hong Kong. For over a century, their primary nightmare was that Russia would challenge this dominance by expanding southward towards the warm water of the Indian Ocean through South Asia. The British fought wars to control Afghanistan and heavily militarized India's northwest frontier to create a buffer against any Russian expansion. At the end of the Second World War, Russia emerged as a force to reckon with. Stalin was pressing his influence into Eastern Europe and Northern Iran. The British realized that the strategic focus of the world was shifting from sea lanes to air power and, crucially, to oil. The Persian Gulf contained the oil reserves vital to the survival of British Commonwealth and the Western world. Britain knew it was financially exhausted and must leave India. But if they left, who would guard the oil? Who would provide the air bases to threaten Soviet military installations in the Urals? But how does this link back to partition of India, you'll ask? Before getting into that, let's step back and see how the argument for partition itself had emerged and taken shape over the years. The origins of Muslim insecurity trace back to the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the British consolidation of power after the 1857 uprising. Having ruled the subcontinent for centuries, the Muslim elite suddenly found themselves politically disempowered. They began lagging behind the Hindu community, which adapted more quickly to Western education and government employment under the British. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 as an inclusive, secular, nationalist organization. It sought to represent all Indians, regardless of religion, in the struggle for self-rule. However, as the movement grew, the Muslim minority began to fear permanent subjugation by a Hindu majority. Some specific instances that fueled Muslim anxieties about their cultural preservation were, firstly, like in 1900, the British permitted the optional use of Hindi script alongside Urdu in United Provinces courts. This sparked fears amongst the Muslims that their linguistic heritage was being deliberately eroded by non-Muslim assertiveness. Also, some of the symbolisms used by the Indian revolutionary movement, such as historical figures like Shivaji and the image of Bharat Mata, were seen as signs of Hindu domination. Muslim insecurities were sharply aggravated by the partition of Bengal in 1905, which was reunited in 1911 due to militant agitation by the nationalists. As the British began introducing the concepts of self-rule and parliamentary democracy, the Muslim elite realized the severe implications of their demography. In a one-man, one-vote democratic system, their status as a 25% numerical minority meant that majority rule would invariably equate to Hindu domination. Believing that Congress would not protect them and they needed their own political voice, Muslim notables formed the All India Muslim League in 1906. They successfully lobbied the British for separate electorates, which was granted in 1909. Thus, the British formally recognized Muslims as a distinct political entity by allowing them to vote exclusively for Muslim candidates to reserved legislative seats. The Congress and Muslim League briefly cooperated against the British in the constitutional struggle for self-rule, culminating in the 1916 Lucknow Pact engineered by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But this unity disintegrated by the late 1920s after the Congress pushed for a strong centralized state. In 1930, poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal laid the intellectual groundwork for partition by proposing a consolidated Muslim state in northwestern India. In 1933, Rahmat Ali, a Cambridge student, coined the name Pakistan for this proposed homeland. He circulated a pamphlet demanding a separate federation for the 30 million Muslims in the northwest. At the time, British and Indian politicians alike dismissed Rahmat Ali's scheme as a student's pipe dream. The decisive turning point arrived after the 1937 provincial elections. The Congress won massive majorities, including in some of the Muslim majority areas, including the Northwest Frontier Province and the Muslim majority areas in Assam, Bihar and United Provinces. Feeling marginalized, Jinnah and the League devised the tactic of adopting the two-nation theory. They asserted that Hindus and Muslims were not just different faiths, but entirely separate nations with irreconcilable social orders and cultures, making coexistence in a united democratic India impossible. Thus, the whole idea of a separate state of Pakistan was revived and revitalized. At this point, Muslim League and Jinnah did not have much political clout, and the Pakistan demand may have never materialized but for the outbreak of World War II and the subsequent events. At the outbreak of the war in September 1939, the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, declared war on Germany on India's behalf without consulting the Indian political parties and elected representatives. Congress was at the height of its political influence then. It was in majority in 8 of the 11 British provincial assemblies in India. The party leadership took it as an affront. Within the party, Mahatma Gandhi initially favoured giving unconditional support to Britain in its fight against fascism. However, Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose successfully pushed for a stronger stance. Remembering how Britain had brutally suppressed the freedom movement after World War I, despite India's wholehearted cooperation during the war, the Congress demanded a definite declaration granting India freedom after the war and immediate participation by them in the central government in Delhi. Remember, while limited democracy in the form of elected governments had been introduced in the provinces, the central government at Delhi was still under the autocratic control of the Viceroy. When the British rejected this demand, the Congress High Command directed all its provincial ministries to resign in October and November 1939. The primary beneficiary of Congress resignation were the Muslim League and Jinnah personally. Because the British were desperate for allies to maintain their war machine and counter the non-cooperative Congress, they eagerly patronized Jinnah. They elevated him to the status of a vital counterweight and effectively gave him a veto over future constitutional advances. Thus, despite his electoral insignificance, Jinnah was propped up as a national leader, giving Muslim League equal stature and bargaining power to Congress in the post-war negotiations on independence. This is where matters stood at the end of World War II. Coming back to the geopolitics, as per the documents quoted by Sarila and Dasgupta in their books, on May 1945, a top secret appraisal by the post-hostilities planning staff of Winston Churchill's war cabinet stated that it was of paramount importance to retain a military connection with the subcontinent. This was to ward off the Soviet threat. By now, thanks to Jinnah's lobbying, the idea of partition of India had taken root. British military commanders were initially against this partition. The Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, submitted a memorandum in May 1945 arguing against Pakistan. He believed that splitting the Indian Army would tempt the Soviets to invade and that a weak Pakistan could not defend itself. The Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946, sent by the post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee, proposed keeping India united under a loose confederation, a weak central government and strong governments within the provinces based on religion. Possibly, it would have looked something like the current-day European Union. This structure wasn't acceptable to both Congress and Muslim League. By early 1947, however, the British Chief of Staff had completely reversed Auchinleck's position. In a memo dated 12th May 1947, they argued that there were overwhelming arguments in favour of Western Pakistan remaining in the Commonwealth because Britain would obtain important strategic facilities, the port of Karachi, air bases, and the support of Muslim manpower. The British military chiefs viewed Nehru as a socialist with pro-Soviet leanings, vehemently opposed to Western imperialism. He was absolutely committed to an independent, non-aligned foreign policy. The British concluded that a united India ruled by a Congress, would never allow Britain to use its territory for military bases against the USSR. On the other hand, Jinnah, eager to please, was explicitly telling the British that a newly created Pakistan would remain within the British Commonwealth. It would welcome British officers and would happily partner with the West in the defence arrangements. Churchill advised the Viceroy Lord Wavell in 1945 to keep a bit of India. The bit he was referring to was the strategic northwest, Baluchistan, the northwest frontier province, West Punjab and Gilgit, the areas bordering Afghanistan, Iran, China and Central Asia. In a 1947 memo, British military planners laid it out perfectly. Pakistan is the keystone of the strategic arch of the wide and vulnerable waters of the Indian Ocean. Prime Minister Attlee realized that he could not force an award of partition without sparking a massive revolt by the Congress party. He needed the Congress to accept partition voluntarily. When the cabinet mission plan had failed, partly because Nehru refused to accept a weak central government and Jinnah refused to yield on the Muslim sovereignty, the backup plan was ready. Lord Mountbatten arrived to execute the division. And although Pakistani leaders were convinced that he was scheming to get India the best deal possible, in hindsight, Mountbatten's actions clearly favoured British strategic imperatives. For instance, he manoeuvred to detach the strategic northwest frontier province from the control and influence of the elected Congress government by pushing through a referendum. It's notable that the province, now known as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, is still not fully integrated with mainstream Pakistan. Mountbatten also created a sense of urgency by preponing the date of independence by almost a year. Under the pressure of this short deadline, he nudged the Congress leaders towards accepting partition of the country. You may recall from the previous episodes, Major William Brown, commanding Gilgit Scouts, had staged a mutiny in Gilgit, arresting the Maharaja's governor and handing the strategic territory over to Pakistan. For this act of blatant treason against the Maharaja, Major Brown was not court-martialed. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire by London. Why? Because British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin privately admitted to the Americans that the main issue in Gilgit was who would control the main artery leading to Central Asia. They wanted it in Pakistan's reliable hands. And Mountbatten later nudged Indian leaders to approach UN and accept a ceasefire before Kashmir was fully liberated, leaving the strategic vital parts of Kashmir under Pakistani control. And what about the role of US? During the 1940s, the United States exerted steady pressure on Britain to grant independence to a united India. American strategic calculations at the time assumed that a united, democratic and secular India would serve as the most effective bulwark against the communist threat in Asia. Declassified State Department documents clearly reflect this preference. In April 1947, just months before the partition, Acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson cabled the US Embassy in London and said, "Our political and economic interests in that part of the world would be best served by the continued integrity of India." The US feared that the balkanization of India would create instability that the communists could exploit. Jinnah was astute. He was well aware of this American preference and had cautioned the Muslim League that their hardline demand for partition might cost them American sympathy. To prevent that, Jinnah took the initiative of approaching the US diplomats in India to ask for establishing diplomatic relations with Pakistan immediately after its formation. Expressing his great admiration for the United States, he conveyed to them that he was hopeful the US will aid Pakistan in its many problems. Of course, it took the United States a few years to develop sufficient interest in the region to consider actually investing in it. United States embraced the geopolitical utility of Pakistan after partition had become a reality. But initially it turned down Pakistan's urgent requests for military and financial assistance in 1947 and 1949. It viewed military ties with the new unstable country as a liability. It was only around 1950, spurred by the communist victory in China and the outbreak of the Korean War, that US reassessed its global security posture. A classified 1951 US National Security Council report notes that air bases in major Pakistan cities would be nearer to a larger portion of Soviet territory than bases in any other available location in Asia or the Near East. As a result of Nehru's stubborn neutrality, the US gradually accepted the British view that Pakistan could serve as a vital northern tier defense against the Soviet Union. This culminated in the US heavily arming Pakistan and bringing it into alliances like SEATO and CENTO in mid-1950s. So how do we reach a dispassionate conclusion about what actually led to the partition of India? Was it imperial machinations, religious fanaticism, or nationalist blunders? First, we must reject the simplistic extremes. Pakistan was not solely a British invention. The religious and cultural fault lines in India were very real. The Congress party bears immense responsibility. Their refusal to share power with the Muslim League, their decision to resign and leave Muslim League to fill the political vacuum during World War II, and their ultimate preference for a truncated India with a strong central government over a united India with a weak centre made partition virtually inevitable. Jinnah smartly exploited Muslim insecurities and leveraged them into a mass movement. Two simple facts subsequently have demonstrated over the years that the two-nation theory was nothing but a fallacy. First is that after 8 decades, India has a greater number of Muslims than living in Pakistan. This debunks the bogey that Muslims would not get their rights being in a minority in a Hindu majority state. Second, the breaking away of East Pakistan to form a new country, Bangladesh, in 1971 debunks the thesis that Muslims of the subcontinent constituted a nation. Historical evidence also compels us to reject the idea that the British were merely neutral referees, unable to adjudicate as Hindus and Muslims fought bitterly. The British did not invent the Hindu-Muslim divide, but they did capitalize on it ruthlessly. Once the British military and political establishment realized that a free, united India under the Congress Party would not join the Western Bloc in the emerging Cold War, they decided that creation of Pakistan was a strategic necessity. They needed a territorial buffer, air bases, and a loyal ally to protect the oil fields of the Middle East and block Soviet expansion. Partition was not just the tragic end of the British Raj, it was the opening move of the Cold War in Asia. The Great Game simply changed its name. Pakistan was conceived by its founders as a sanctuary for Indian Muslims, but it was midwifed by the British to be the keystone of the strategic arch for Western defense. Understanding this intersection of internal communal strife and external geopolitical maneuvering doesn't just explain the tragedy of 1947. It also explains the subsequent decades of South Asian history, why Pakistan was flooded with Western arms, why India turned towards the Soviet Union, and why the borders drawn in blood 80 years ago remain some of the most volatile flashpoints of the globe today. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. See you in the next episode soon.